This is Chapter 6, Proteins, Crucial Components of All Body Tissues. So to begin with, let's define what proteins are. Proteins are a very diverse group of large complex molecules that are composed of amino acids. As with our other organic compounds, these contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, with the addition of nitrogen. So we're going to see these have a huge amount of nitrogen in them. Okay? In fact, it's a special form of nitrogen that our bodies can use. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids that are used to make proteins. The general structure of an amino acid is shown here. You have a central carbon. Off of that carbon, all carbons have 4 available bonds. So if we take a look at the available bonds here, we have one that is going to be hydrogen. One is what's called an acid group. It is a C double bond O, OH group. That's called an acid group because this group can actually lose this H, creating an acid. We also have an amine group. The amine group, that is our nitrogen-containing group. So here is our nitrogen bonded to 2H. And then finally have this side chain. The side chain is also called a variable region, sometimes referred to as an R group. What differs in these 20 different amino acids is this side chain here. So we have some examples. This would be glycine. Glycine is the simplest of the amino acids, and its side chain is simply an H, our hydrogen. So this is the simplest of our glycine, of our amino acids, which is glycine. Here we have something called leucine. Leucine has this branching structure where we have 4 carbons with their hydrogens bonded to it. This would be aspartic acid. If you notice, this has an acid group at the end that looks similar to the acid group we have in the amino acid. Okay, so when we talk about amino acids, we have the amine group, the acid group, and the side group, all bound to a central carbon. Now, in terms of these amino acids, we have something called essential amino acids. And when we hear essential means, from a human standpoint, essential amino acids are those amino acids that cannot be produced by our bodies. Therefore, it is essential that we obtain them from our food. They must be obtained from our food. Of the 20 amino acids, 9 are considered essential amino acids. These are the essential amino acids that we have to get from our food. These include histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. Now, the non-essential amino acids, these can be produced by the body, manufactured by the body, either from other amino acid precursors or from other chemical precursors, and these include alanine, arginine, asparagine, aspartic acid, cysteine, glutamic acid, glutamine, glycine, proline, serine, and tyrosine. Now, the way we take these amino acids and make proteins is we actually create long chains of amino acids held together by peptide bonds. Peptide bonds are bonds that form between 2 adjacent amino acids. The number or the order of the amino acids is going to be very important in what a protein does and how it functions. And that order and number of amino acids is dictated by the DNA, right? So within a specific gene within our DNA is going to have the information, the coding, what's called the coding information for the protein, right? Please take some time to check out the protein building blocks animation on Mastering Nutrition or in Blackboard. Now, to give you just a quick overview of gene expression, we all know that we have DNA, and DNA is important. What you might not know is why DNA is so important. So DNA contains all of the information in a stored form to make all of the proteins that our body could need. What DNA does, DNA is going to be transcribed. Right? The process of transcription takes place within our nucleus. It's the process of taking DNA and making a portable, usable copy through the process of transcription called mRNA, or messenger RNA. That messenger RNA, when it is copying just the region of a gene for a particular protein of interest, that mRNA will leave the nucleus and go out. It will find the ribosomes. Okay, the ribosomes are little protein-making factories. Those ribosomes then do a process called translation, and translation takes the code of the DNA and actually uses that, reads that code, and builds a protein. And the way it builds the protein is by reading amino acid after amino acid, amino acid, and putting those amino acids together into a chain. Now that chain is the precursor to our final protein. We will see that this protein is often more complex than simply a chain of amino acids. What makes the protein what it is often has to do with some of the higher levels of organization. Now, one key thing we need to think about in terms of proteins in the body is what's called protein turnover. And protein turnover involves both the synthesis or creation of new proteins and the degradation or the breakdown of proteins. And our body is constantly going through this protein turnover. Okay. So within the human body, cells are going to respond to the changing demands of physiology by either creating proteins or breaking proteins down. So here there's actually several animations you should check out either on Mastering Nutrition or on Blackboard, including deamination, transamination, the protein synthesis, and then digestion and absorption, which we'll get into in a few moments. So just a kind of overview of what we see during protein turnover, right? Synthesis and breakdown. Right? We get amino acids from our food. Right? We also get amino acids from the breakdown of our cells. So when we are consuming protein in our diet, there's amino acids in that. Right? Those are going to go in, and we'll talk about digestion and how we take these amino acids from food and we put them into our amino acid pool. Okay. That amino acid pool is basically where amino acids are within the body, and they can be used for various things. So they can be used to synthesize non-protein compounds that have nitrogen. Okay. So some things called creatinine and serotonin, those are going to need nitrogen, so they use the amino acids in an indirect way by breaking those amino acids down. More directly, those amino acids may be used to make proteins. Okay. Many things in the body are protein in nature, whether they be things like enzymes, and we've mentioned enzymes repeatedly, antibodies, which are important in the immune system, or cell components. Right? So parts of the cells, many of the structures of cells are protein in nature. Those amino acids from the amino acid pool can also be broken down and changed to make into fat. Right? So we do have the ability to produce fat from protein. Amino acids can also be made into glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis. And then finally, we can have energy produced from the amino acids, but this is not the common path for energy production. Okay. Now, what's left over, fats and glucose don't have nitrogen. So when using amino acids to make fat or to make glucose or to produce energy, there's excess nitrogen. We have to get rid of that nitrogen. So that nitrogen gets taken over to the liver, and it's going to be synthesized into something called urea, and then the urea gets excreted through the kidneys in the form of urine. Okay, so we would call this nitrogenous waste. Now, in terms of proteins are very diverse, as I've mentioned before. Right? Some proteins are enzymatic, so they do a job. Some proteins are structural. And really what dictates what a protein does is based on its shape. There are 4 main levels of organization in most proteins. The first level is called the primary structure, and that is a sequence of amino acids. How many amino acids and what order they are in. That's determined directly by the DNA and by the information coded within the genes. Now, the secondary structure, we get what's called an alpha helix. It's a spiral, and this is due to what are called hydrogen bonds that occur between these amino acids. Remember, we're showing them as little balls here, but they really are a central carbon with an amine group one direction, the acid group the other direction, and then that R group sticking off the side. So depending on the interactions between the oxygens and the hydrogens that you might see, we would see this spiral, and then also something called a beta sheet, which is a fold, a deeper fold. Now we also have what's called a third level, or a tertiary structure. Right? That tertiary structure is going to occur when we have interactions between those side chains, or those variable groups. And then finally, that quaternary structure, that's the highest level of structure, and that is going to be where you have multiple subunits all functioning together. So for example, looking at the 4th level, this is what's called an actin myofilament. And actin myofilaments are important in muscles and how muscles contract. This is the quaternary structure. Each of these subunits, each of these is a different protein. These little balls, they're called globular proteins. If you were to take a look at any one of these little balls, this is called G-actin. And the G-actin is actually made from this folded structure, where you can see you have these spirals and then these folds. The shape of this would be determined by interactions of those variable groups or side chains. Right? Each of these spirals in here would be determined by the hydrogen bonding, and that would be determined by the order of those amino acids. Okay, so those are the 4 levels of protein organization. Now, proteins have a very specific function, and their function is dependent upon their shape. So when the shape gets changed or lost, their function often goes away. Right? When proteins lose their shape, we call this denaturation. You denature the protein. And proteins may lose shape when they are subjected to heat, acids and bases, heavy metals, or alcohol. And that denaturation results in an irreversible loss of protein function. Right? And it often changes the actual structure. And one good way to think about this is if you cook meat, something like a steak is primarily protein. The organization, a steak is actually muscle. Muscle is mostly protein. When you cook meat, it has a very different consistency than when you have raw meat or uncooked meat. The heat of cooking actually denatures the protein, changes the shape of the protein. Now, in terms of things like acids, there is a process where you can cure. It's in some places it's called ceviche, and it's a raw fish that's basically put into a lemon juice concentrate, and that lemon juice, quote unquote, cooks the meat. And what it does is it doesn't cook it using heat, it cooks it with the acid. Now, for the most part, in terms of food things, we usually do not eat foods that are cooked in bases or heavy metals, or alcohol usually. Now, this is very important because this is going to have an effect on some of the higher body functions, especially the things like heat and acids and bases. What we have here is an example of a protein with a very complex shape. Okay? This is a hemoglobin group. Right? The hemoglobin molecule is really 4 separate subunits, right? 2 alpha and 2 beta subunits. And within each of these there is this heme, right, which has an iron atom in the center. This molecule is important in carrying oxygen, and we find it in our red blood cells. Right? And we'll talk about the importance of iron at a later time. Now, for those essential amino acids that we need, we get most of those through our diet. Right? That leads us to 2 definitions that have to do with the food source. So these are definitions of proteins in the diet, where we have incomplete or complete proteins. An incomplete protein is a protein that does not contain all of the essential amino acids in sufficient quantities. So if you were to consume a diet that was only based on incomplete proteins, you would be missing some of these key essential amino acids. Right? This would be considered a low-quality protein, and your health and growth may be compromised because you don't have all of those amino acids that are necessary. Compare that then to what's called a complete protein, and the complete proteins are those that contain sufficient amounts of the 9 essential amino acids and therefore are considered high-quality proteins. Now, there's something called mutual supplementation, and this is when you take 2 incomplete proteins that complement one another, and those would be complementary proteins. So if you have one food source that is lacking a particular amino acid and a different food source protein that has that amino acid, those 2 things can complement. They can make up for the weakness in the other. Right? And a great example is beans and rice. Beans and rice is actually a staple in many diets. And so legumes, those would be the beans, those are limited in methionine and cysteine. Right? However, foods like rice, which is going to be a grain, as well as nuts and seeds, those are high in those particular limiting amino acids. So those have methionine and cysteine. So when you combine those into something like rice and beans, you now have a complete protein. Right, the combination of those. Right? So things like rice and lentils, rice and black-eyed peas, and also hummus. Right? Hummus, properly prepared hummus, is a mix of garbanzo beans and sesame seeds. Marketed usually as what's called tahini. So these are why these are staples in many diets, because it provides all of the needed proteins, the needed amino acids. Things like peanut butter and bread. Peanut butter and bread is actually a complementary food combination. Right? Grains, the whole wheat bread made from grains, are limited in lysine, but legumes, the peanuts, have plenty of those. Okay. So then we also see things like tofu and broccoli with almonds. Adding nuts can often, in terms of if you have vegetables are very limited in lysine, methionine, and cysteine. So if you add seeds or nuts, you get the methionine and cysteine, and then if you add beans, you get the lysine. So taking vegetables and mixing in beans of any sort, legumes of any sort, with nuts and seeds gives you a complete protein. Now, proteins are very important. We do not use proteins as a primary energy source. Please remember that would be our carbohydrates and our fats. However, we do need proteins for cell growth, repair, and maintenance because many of the physical structures within cells are going to be protein in nature. We need these to make enzymes, and we need enzymes to do all of our metabolic jobs. So metabolism cannot occur without enzymes. Many of our hormones are protein in nature. Proteins are also important in fluid and electrolyte balance, as well as pH balance. Proteins are also important in our immune system. Antibodies are protein in nature. And then in limited sense, we use these proteins as an energy source, but that's not the first function of proteins. So when you have a chance, please watch the enzyme animation available on either Mastering Nutrition or on Blackboard to go through and talk a little bit about the digestion of proteins. So when we consume something that is protein, in our mouth we have no protein digestion occurring. We have only what's called mechanical digestion, which is just the physical breakdown. So we actually crush the food, break it into smaller pieces, and moisten it with our saliva. There are no enzymes present in the mouth. Okay. When that protein is swallowed, it moves into the stomach, and here two things happen. The first is the proteins are going to be denatured by the hydrochloric acid. Remember, so that denaturation changes the shape of the protein. Okay. Then we also have pepsin becoming activated. Right? Hydrochloric acid breaks down the protein. It also activates pepsin, and pepsin is an enzyme that takes big proteins and breaks them into short polypeptides and amino acids. When we have the term polypeptide are short chains of amino acids, and then single amino acids as well. When the food source then continues into the small intestine, the pancreas releases enzymes called proteases, and those proteases, there are several different kinds of proteases, can break those proteins down into single amino acids. Some proteins are not digestible because we do not have the correct enzymes to break them down, and those are considered lower quality nutrition because if you can't break them down, you can't use them. The amino acids then are absorbed from the small intestine and are going to be transported to the liver, and the liver then is going to kind of dish those out to the cells as they need them. In order for a protein to be considered high quality, it has to be digestible. And most protein from animal sources are highly digestible. Soy product protein and then the legumes have highly digestible proteins, whereas the proteins found in vegetables and grains are less digestible, so they're less able to be broken down, so they're considered to be lower quality. Now, in terms of determining how much a protein a person needs, it's really based upon what's called a nitrogen balance. Okay? The nitrogen balance is really based upon how much nitrogen is being taken in and how much is being excreted, the consumption and the excretion of nitrogen. And that proper protein intake depends on the activity level of the individual, the age, and the health status. Right? And we'll talk about some very specific health status changes that change the amount of nitrogen or proteins that are needed. Right? So please take a minute and watch a nitrogen balancing animation on mastering. Okay. Some people who do require more protein are children and adolescents, individuals who are still growing, because in these phases there's going to be a huge amount of use of the nitrogen. Right. Pregnant and lactating women, because they are either creating and growing a small person within them or producing a food source using lots of protein. Athletes, because athletes are often burning huge amounts of energy and then also need to conserve their muscle. And then vegetarians. And the reasons for that, the vegetarians often take in lower quality protein that is not animal in base, and we'll talk about that separately. So for an average person, not one from those special categories, 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily, or somewhere between 10 and 35% of the total caloric intake or energy intake should be from protein. Now, in terms of looking at nitrogen balance, what's called a positive nitrogen balance is when you have more nitrogen consumption than nitrogen excretion. What that means is that nitrogen is going to be used somewhere. So when the nitrogen is being taken in, it's being used, so it's not being excreted. So this is what's considered a positive nitrogen balance. And if you have a growing child, where is that nitrogen being used? Well, it's being used in the proteins that are making the cells to help that child grow. Here we have a negative nitrogen balance. Here where the nitrogen consumption is less than the nitrogen excretion. This is the result of starvation, consumption of very low energy diets, illness, and severe injuries. And in this case, what's actually happening is less nitrogen is being taken in that's being excreted, and that's a sign that things like the muscles are being broken down to use for energy, and that excess nitrogen from the muscle breakdown is being excreted. Now, what should be occurring in healthy adults who are not pregnant, not our children, not sick, is that the amount of nitrogen consumed is equal to the amount of nitrogen excreted. Now, in terms of the recommended protein intakes, we've already mentioned 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day. That is for most adults, again, not one of those special categories. Now, athletes have much higher recommendations because in order to preserve muscle and prevent muscle from being broken down as an additional energy source, they have higher protein recommendations. For the most part, in terms of dietary, in the United States, most people from the United States do meet or exceed the RDA for dietary protein, unless they are on some of the more out there diets. We do get protein from many sources, and not just from meat. So sources of protein can be things like dairy products, legumes, eggs, nuts, and whole grains. And there's some new things out there. Quinoa is one that's probably very, very popular right now. You may see that even in restaurants. The corn and the amaranth are not as popular. So here's a protein content of some common foods. So you can compare the serving size, the grams of protein, in terms of things like dairy, comparing dairy to beef or any of the other meats, soy products, vegetables. Right? So if we were to compare carrots, right, a raw carrot has 0.07 grams of protein, as opposed to 3 ounces of lean, baked, ground meat has 22 grams. So there's a very big difference here. Now, in terms of getting enough protein, most people think that protein has to come from animal sources, and that's not necessarily true. Vegetarianism is a type of diet. It's actually many different types of diets, but the main thing that goes along with vegetarianism is restricting the intake of animal products. Right? So there are reasons why people choose to be vegetarians, and there's different kinds of vegetarians. Something that's sometimes called a partial vegetarian or a semi-vegetarian. These are people who eat seafood, poultry, eggs, dairy products. Basically, they avoid red meat. So some people don't even consider themselves vegetarians. They just say, I don't consume red meat. So in this case, there's really no limitations because there's no difference between the protein taken in from red meat and the protein taken in from seafood or poultry. Okay. There's also something called a pesca vegetarian. Pesca vegetarian will only eat seafood products. They exclude poultry. The pesca comes from fish, right? So they will eat fish in their diets. Sometimes also called pescivores. Then there's the ovo-lacto or the lacto-ovo vegetarian, lacto having to do with milk, ovo having to do with eggs. So these do not take in any animal flesh or seafood, but they do consume dairy products, cheeses, milks, and eggs. Then there are the two separate ones, a lacto-vegetarian versus an ovo-vegetarian, where they either exclude eggs. The lacto-vegetarian excludes eggs but eats dairy. The ovo-vegetarian excludes dairy but eats eggs. The final, more strict type are what are called vegans or strict vegetarians, and these are individuals who only eat plant-based foods. They do not eat any animal products, no dairy, no eggs. Okay. The final kind are what are called macrobiotic. All right, macrobiotic is a very, very strict form of veganism, and it's actually a progression diet where things become more and more limited until finally macrobiotic diet is really just down to brown rice and tea or water, and this is an extreme diet. Most people do not follow this type diet. And then there is something that's referred to sometimes as a fruitarian, and this is when individuals eat only fruits, seeds, things that are produced separately, and don't result in the death of the plant that they are consuming. For example, if you eat a carrot, you have killed that carrot, because the carrot is the root of the plant, whereas fruitarians only eat raw, dried fruit, because the fruit, you can pick an apple off of an apple tree without killing the apple tree. Okay. In terms of the problems associated with the diets, the first few, because they have plenty of protein in them, it's all about getting protein from the correct sources to get the proper amount of those essential amino acids. As we move into the veganism, the macrobiotic, these usually have problems because there is not enough vitamins or even just energy intake. Now, some of you may be vegetarians, and some of you may be vegetarians for health reasons, for ecological reasons, religious or ethical reasons, or concerns over food safety. There's many different reasons, usually quite personal, as to why someone chooses to be a vegetarian. Now, there are some definite health benefits of vegetarianism if done properly. If somebody is on a healthy vegetarian diet, they tend to have an overall lower intake of fat and energy, lower blood pressure, tend to have a reduced risk of heart disease and cancer, and fewer digestive problems. And then again, I say that as if someone is eating a healthy vegetarian diet, because I have known people who claim to be vegetarians and live on things like cheese doodles, which are not healthy. They are vegetarian, but they're not healthy. So overall, vegetarianism can be quite healthy. It is also challenging, though. There is some possibility of having a lack of certain vitamins. Right? So vegetarians need to plan a balanced and adequate diet, and that's no different than anything else. We had said earlier in one of the previous chapters, the hallmarks of any healthy diet are balance, adequate, moderation, and variety. So a vegetarian diet should follow the same. Some of the key things: soy products are a good protein source, and definitely vegetarians need to think about those complementary proteins, things like rice and beans. And there's actually a special food guide pyramid. Remember in a previous chapter we looked at the ethnic versions of the food guide pyramid. Here we see the vegetarian food guide pyramid, where at every meal we have the basis of those grains, fruits and vegetables, and the legumes and beans. This is obviously not for a vegan. This would be for an ovo-lacto vegetarian that eats the egg and the dairy as well. Now, there are risks associated with eating too much protein. Some of the possible problems are high cholesterol and heart disease. Animal source protein has higher overall cholesterol in it, especially depending on the type of cut of meat. So some of the best, quote-unquote, cuts of red meat would be things like ribeye steaks. Ribeye steaks have a very clear layer of fat on them. That fat is going to be saturated fat. That fat is going to be very high in cholesterol. Okay. Interestingly, too much protein in the diet from any source can lead to excess calcium excretion, and that has to do with some of the fluid balance things. And that can lead to bone loss. Finally, kidney disease. Because when proteins are being broken down, they lead to nitrogen being produced. That nitrogen needs to be cleared from the body. That occurs through the kidneys. People who have extremely high protein diets may have a higher risk of kidney disease, especially people who are already susceptible to kidney disease. So somebody who has known kidney disease should definitely not be on a high protein diet. They should have a very carefully limited protein diet. Now, there are cases of malnutrition. We have what's called protein energy malnutrition. This is when you have an inadequate intake of protein and energy. When you have not enough energy being taken in, the body starts to break down its protein to get energy. The two most common serious forms, which are not terribly prevalent in the United States, are marasmus and kwashiorkor. Marasmus, this is when you have a disease that results from a severely inadequate intake of protein, energy, and other nutrients. What happens here, the wasting of muscle tissue, the body actually starts burning and breaking down its own muscle tissue in order to create new proteins and new energy. Right? Because this is happening, we see this stunted physical growth, so the growth does not keep up on par. Right? This is especially problematic when you have developing children. This can also lead to stunted brain development or neurological development and anemia. Kwashiorkor, this is extremely low protein intake. There is some weight loss and muscle wasting. There's also this edema that results in distension of the belly, and then slowed growth and development. And this is often seen in children in developing countries who have very low protein intake, who survive on diets pretty much of just plain white rice or just a wheat-based product. And if you have ever seen those commercials that come on television sometimes, the Save the Children type commercials, and you see the young children, especially in developing nations, that look very thin arms and legs and very rounded bellies, that belly is actually a distension of the abdomen due to edema, which is swelling. And that has to do with the fact that protein is important in water balance.